to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after shame any way we can get to it because we understand how impactful and harmful it is to our systems to be in spaces of shame. And we particularly do this in areas of sexuality, mental health, even religion and spirituality. But today we're definitely going to be on a sexual theme for sure. I have a really cool guest I'm excited to introduce here in a second. Really quickly, just a few things to let you all know. If you're interested, my group practice has been really delving into the work of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. We've been running some groups, which has been a really interesting way of administering this medicine. And we have two groups coming up later on this summer and fall. One on recovering from male sexual shame. This is usually for people who were influenced by high demand religions, grew up with a lot of ideas around kind of the structure and language of pornography or sex addiction instead of more sex positive ways of understanding their sexuality. And so they're usually needing a lot of healing and reclaiming around those types of topics. And we're also going to have a ketamine group on religious trauma and healing from religious trauma and spiritual abuse and things of that nature. So if you're at all interested in either one of those events or other events that we have coming up, just contact my practice at simcounseling.com, or you can also go to my website at natashahelfer.com. All right, without further ado, with me today, I have Stefani Goerlich, Dr. Stefani Goerlich. I'm going to give a little bit of a bio, but I'm much more excited for you to introduce yourself. But Stefani is the founder of Bound Together Counseling. She is a certified sex therapist and clinical social worker. You specialize in working with gender, sexuality, and relationship differences. Stefani is an instructor at 2 universities where she teaches classes on sexual dysfunction, paraphilias, digital sexuality and social media, sexual trauma, and trauma-informed care. She's a popular conference speaker, which I can attest to. I have been in your presentations, and you're super fun and super intelligent and just really bring a lot of wit and wisdom to all the things you talk about. And she's a frequent voice in media, ranging from the New Yorker to the BBC to Cosmopolitan and Teen Vogue. She's a certified forensic social worker. We should do a podcast just on that. That's very interesting in of itself. And a board certified forensic sexologist who frequently consults on legal cases involving elements of unusual sexual expression and alternative relationships. She is the award-winning author of 5 books on BDSM, kink, and mental health, and co-hosts the popular Securing Sexuality podcast, which is currently on hiatus, and as well as being a student at Wayne State University, where she is pursuing a second PhD in social work. Her research focuses on conceptualizations of deviance, particularly in forensic contexts. And in her free time, whatever she has left, she's a mother, a partner, a collector of tarot decks. I have 2 cool ones to show you. A stitcher, a snarky cross stitch, and an active member of her local Jewish community. Welcome to the show, Dr. Goerlich. I'm so excited to have you.
So much for having me. Thank you so much to have me is where my head went with that. That did not make
It's okay. That is okay. Yeah. And we are here in particular to cover the book With Sprinkles on Top, which is, I think, a super important addition to, I guess, the sex therapy research or literature that is out there available for people to get help with things that they're dealing with. So, but before we even get into that, tell me anything you want to tell me that wouldn't be part of a regular bio about yourself, how you're in this space, what is bringing you to write books like this. Tell us a little bit more about you in your own voice.
Yeah. So, I have a background actually in the world of domestic violence, sexual assault survivor advocacy. That is where my career started. That is really where my passion lies in so many ways. And so I spent 15 years working with people who had their bodies, their sexuality, their relationships kind of weaponized against them. And it's important work and it's necessary work and it's very draining work. And after a certain point, I wanted to, stay in the ballpark of that world, but maybe do something that felt more uplifting as opposed to restorative. And I know those are similar, but I hope people feel my vibe. So I went back after my MSW and I did my sex therapy training. And in my sex therapy training, you know this because you co-facilitate these things that are called SARS, sexual attitudes reassessments. And we're sitting and the goal of this is to confront your own biases as a clinician. So that when you get out in the field, you know where your sweet spots are, you know where your trigger points are, and you can really be mindful in your practice because sex therapists, I believe, can do a lot of harm if we're not practicing with skill. Mm-hmm. So we're watching all sorts of different relationships and all sorts of different sexuality. And, there are older couples who can't have penetrative sex anymore, but they're holding each other and they're caressing and they're petting. And the people around me are saying, oh, that's so romantic. Oh, that's so beautiful. I hope my partner and I are like that when we are old. And, there are conversations with sex workers and the clients who use sex workers. And people are like, wow, I've never really thought about that before. That really changes my perception of this. And then we got to the section on BDSM and kink. And the whole energy in the room changed. And it didn't feel supportive and curious anymore. And now people were giggling, people were whispering, people were cracking jokes in the SAR. And I realized that even in a community of people who are already fully licensed mental health providers, who have self-selected into sexual health as their vocation, that there are still people who are having their bodies and their relationships and their sexualities weaponized against them. I literally started writing my first book the weekend I did my SAR.
Oh, wow.
And I have written 4 books on BDSM, kink, and mental health since then, including Sprinkles. Mm-hmm. And then, I am about on Monday to turn in the manuscript for book number 5, which my partner Wolf and I wrote together. So that's kind of the behind the scenes of, why this topic, why these people, why this work is because I really think that people should be celebrated for what brings them joy and what makes them feel whole and what brings connection into their relationships. And even in really, really inclusive spaces, you don't always get that. And I wanted to help change that. So,
yeah. Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are watching, this is the picture of the book with Sprinkles on top. Everything vanilla people and their kinky partners need to know to communicate, explore, and connect. I really resonate with what you're saying about the biases. I think I was definitely one of those clinicians that needed to really understand my own biases around a lot of this work. And especially like you're saying, when many of us have experiences with non-consensual sexual activities. I was a victim of child sexual abuse myself. And then, of course, very concerned about that, but also very sexually interested and curious. And just noticing even in my own personal journey and also in the journey of my clients, how often assumptions are made about whether or not something is healthy or not healthy for people instead of with people. And I think the whole theme of kink and BDSM is one of those areas where I have I'm often finding myself telling clinicians I'm training that it can oftentimes be weaponized through actually very helpful therapeutic models. Like, for example, people who are like, oh, well, you're interested in kink or non-monogamy or BDSM, you must have attachment issues. So now they're taking, a very well-known theoretical model, which has a lot of great application, which is the attachment theory model, but using it in a way that weaponizes people's sexual eroticism, pleasure, and components of their erotic preferences. So I'm super interested to dive into this with you. One of the things that I think I want to ask you right off the bat, people oftentimes understand that one of the very common reasons somebody might attend sex therapy is due to drive differences, meaning, one of us is higher libido, one of us is lower libido. I think this idea that we may be into different things, that we may have different sexual preferences is more foreign. So can we start there as far as your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I like to differentiate between drive differences and desire differences. And often we tend to conflate them, right? We think of the libido as the sex desire. Like, I want sex, I don't want sex. I want a lot of sex, I want a little sex. And that's libido, but that's not necessarily the same thing as desire. Like, when you say sex and when I say sex, what are we both thinking about? What are we envisioning? When I say I have a very high sex drive, but I don't like a lot of, orgasms. I have a very high sex drive, but I'm not interested in having many orgasms. All of a sudden, clinicians and frankly, most partners get very confused. But that's what sex is. That's the goal of. And so the calculus becomes confusing. So separating out what people want from how often they want it is really, really important. And when it comes to kinky people specifically, it can become even more challenging because a lot of kinky people consider their kink identity, their kink affinity to be a part of their core erotic self. I mean, the words that want to come out are their kink orientation. And I will say that now that I've said it, but I never lead with that because it can be very off-putting to people. Like, orientation. Are you saying somebody's born kinky? Are you saying it's the same as being queer or trans? And often people get very resistant to that idea. So when I'm writing, when I'm speaking, I usually will say kink affinity or kink identity. But kinky people will tell you that for many of them, it absolutely is a part of their sexual orientation. So that also becomes, when we talk about desire, the desire difference. Because now it's not just what do we want, but potentially who do we want? When do we want? How do we want? It's a much different conversation than just how often.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you start with that. And I would say, and you can tell me if you agree or not, that I think this is somewhat generational too. Like when I work with people who are 30 and younger, this idea that they are identifying a certain way, orienting a certain way, talking about themselves a certain way, even as they date and partner and have sex with people, from the get-go, they're being very honest and open about these things, and therefore attracting other people who are also open and honest about these things. Now, for my population, which is usually people who come from religiously conservative cultures and also older generations, this doesn't trend to be so much the history. Oftentimes what I'm noticing, and what I notice your book is maybe geared to, is that people have not been open about these things from the get-go. And now that they are in partnership, there is now a disclosure, let's say. Somebody is going to start talking about this in a way that they as a couple are not used to talking about it. And so it becomes this anxious, and you talk about it quite a bit in the book, kind of this anxious moment of a lot of stories. What does this mean? What are you talking about? What should I be worried about? What else have you not been sharing with me? Right. So tell me about kind of the audiences here that we're kind of addressing today.
So this is tricky because I want to yes and also no but everything you just said.
I love it. Let's do all of that.
There's a little bit, and I can only speak anecdotally, right? I can't point to a research study on this yet, although, give me time. I might get there. I might do the research. But anecdotally, as somebody who spends a lot of time talking to non-kinky people about kink, a lot of time, at a lot of different levels, right? From like undergrad college sexuality classes through to professional conferences where people are in their 50s and 60s, 70s. I've observed what I like to think of as almost like a generational paradox. you're right. Younger people are much more transparent about all the different facets of themselves, and they're very comfortable sharing all the different facets of themselves. And a part of that is, I think, just the nature of technology and how younger people have grown up with this default setting of sharing all the things, which is something that, I explore in depth in the next book, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Where that becomes a friction point, I have noticed, especially when I'm guest lecturing in undergrad classes, 18 to 20, we'll say 6-year-olds. They often push back when I say that kinky people, many of them consider it to be an orientation. They're comfortable with sharing, I enjoy BDSM, I'm into kink. That is not the problem. In the same way that they'll share, I love anime, I raise backyard chickens, and I'm super active in, like, I don't know, Democratic Socialists of America. Like, they will share a lot of personal information. But the minute I introduce the idea that many kinky people will say this is a core part of themselves, there's a tension there. And I get a lot of pushback because younger people are so aware of the erosion of civil rights and the lack of protection for marginalized people that often that statement can almost provoke a little bit of anger. This idea that, how dare you take this thing that you could choose to do or choose not to do and compare it to my sexual orientation or compare it to my gender identity. And resistance to the idea that for kinky people, that is an apt comparison. But the older people that I speak with who remember the time when being gay was illegal, when raids were happening on bars and on parks, when, homosexuality was in the DSM, they are much more comfortable with the idea that maybe there's this core part of yourself that isn't socially accepted. And maybe there's this thing that makes a lot of sense for you, and we don't understand it yet because we don't talk about it. Might not be as comfortable with kink itself, but they're almost more comfortable with the idea of kink as an identity or as a facet of orientation, in a way that younger people are much more comfortable with. Let me tell you all about my whips and chains, but don't try to say that this is comparable to my fight for inclusion and equality. It's this fascinating tension that exists. And I do end up trying to, speak to both worlds, which, comes to, I think, sort of your initial question of, I always tell my clients our brains are storytelling machines. We give the gray matter a set of facts, and either we connect the threads between those facts or the gray matter will do it for us. And in the absence of understanding, we will always create a narrative to help us understand. And that's where a lot of the conversations I have with the couples that I work with come into play. Because if somebody has been married for 15 years and then one day they come out with, by the way, I've always had a high heel fetish. And I married a Birkenstocks woman. And so I've never really brought it up, but I really want you to know that, like, in my heart of hearts, I would kill to see you in a pair of heels. In isolation, that's just a fact. But if we've never really thought about that as a sexual thing, if we're not necessarily comfortable with fetishes in general, if we don't have an erotic vocabulary or good comprehensive sex education, there's going to be a lot of questions that pop up around that idea. And the brain will create stories to fill in those gaps. And often those stories are, what does it mean that you've never told me? Why are you telling me this now? What's happened that's bringing it up? What does it say about me that you're telling me I'm a Birkenstocks woman and you're into high heels? So you're telling me you've never really liked me? What's going on? And the brain just kind of spirals. So the work I do is helping people tell each other their stories.
Yeah. I think that that's very much the experience I seem to have around this topic, is kind of that initial response of the partner who's being told something new is either a response of fear, of worry about what does this mean as far as expectations go? Like, does that now mean that I need to fulfill these fantasies that you're sharing? Is that on me now? And also kind of, I think, maybe even a shame response, like, what is this about? And am I embarrassed about this? Does this change my sense of who you are as a person? Right. So lots of things. And I think for you and me, not that I want to speak for you, but for me, it's always kind of sad that that's where our stories go, is to places of fear and shame and concern, instead of like curiosity and playfulness and humor and trusting what are we going to do with this? How are we going to negotiate this? Is there anything to negotiate or not? Just because you bring something up doesn't mean automatically it's on me to perform your wildest fantasies, but there might be some room for that, right? But that doesn't seem to be how it goes. So what are kind of the initial maybe myths or concerns or worries that because you cover a lot of them in this book?
Specifically with BDSM and kink, because we don't have many positive pop culture portrayals. That's a lot of P's. Try saying that 5 times fast. Best, maybe people might have like a knowledge anchor point in like 50 Shades of Grey, which is problematic in its own right. And that's if they're even like familiar with that. A lot of people, my more religious clients, your more religious clients would have avoided all of that anyway too. Mm-hmm. So if they even have sort of a knowledge anchor point to latch onto, it's very rarely going to be a positive portrayal. I talk a lot about how in the popular media, kinky people are portrayed either as the butt of a joke or as a threat to the hero. Mm-hmm. There's really no middle ground. You get like the gimp suit or you get the serial killer. And so if all of a sudden your partner comes and says, yeah, that's always been me and I've never known how to tell you, our brains look for what we know in order to understand. And if all we know is butt of joke or serial killer, then culturally we're not doing a good job of supporting couples and frankly kinky people either. And so then, the work becomes, well, let's start with what you think you understand. Tell me what you already know about this thing, about this idea. Tell me what you already know about high heels. Set aside your partner. Just give me the TED Talk off the cuff sort of. And then we start from there first, because I first want to understand sort of when your partner shares this with you, what images are coming to your mind. And then we kind of deconstruct from there. Yeah.
Okay. So you're pretty much putting out there that it's really important to look at the stories that we're creating and understand where we're coming from as far as the context we've had, and then be able to explore from there is an important thing. I know we did this the first time I interviewed you on kink, but it's probably worthwhile doing again because I don't know who's listened to what. Maybe we should just go through some vocabulary. Like, what do we mean by kink? What do we mean by BDSM? What are we as clinicians thinking about versus maybe what are the more cultural ways people think about those terms?
Okay. I'm a social worker. I love a good operant definition. So when I say kink is a ginormous umbrella term. And kink really just means anything that is atypical for its place and time. And that's really important to understand because what that means is it's a fluid definition, and what we consider to be kinky changes with place and with time.
Right.
We are in 2025 America right now, and it would not be scandalous at all for me to walk out of the house wearing what I'm wearing. But in other cultures, revealing my hair, showing my face, having bare arms would be absolutely socially unacceptable. So where we're having this conversation matters. And then also when, because our understanding of sexuality, our understanding of human nature evolves over time. I just finished a book chapter on sort of the history of problematic sex, meaning what have we considered problematic over time? And if you go back to Victorian parenting manuals, like the Dr. Sears of the Victorian era, they were advising people to pin their children's nightgown sleeves to the mattress at night so that their hands wouldn't wander in their sleep. They sold actual like sharp-toothed toddler chastity devices to make sure that your small child did not engage in anything unacceptable. In 2025, if I posit the idea of selling toddler chastity cages, I'm probably going to jail. So the time changes too, right? Like the things that are considered wild and crazy in one era or absolutely morally depraved and dangerous in one era are totally fine in another. So kink at its core just means whatever is atypical for its time and place. Recognizing that answer can and will change.
Yeah.
BDSM falls under the umbrella of kink. And when we talk about BDSM, what we're really talking about is the researcher Richard Sproat calls it the eroticization of power. So it's playing with power in our sexual and our relational lives. It's my favorite acronym because I love a Swiss Army knife and it contains several smaller concepts within. So B&D is bondage and discipline. Bondage and discipline is an exchange of control. So control can mean control of speech, control of movement, control of behavior. If you tell me that the only way we can do this interview is if I stand in the corner facing the wall the entire time, you're not actually doing anything to me. We are hundreds of miles apart. But it would be an act of control on your part to say, as the host, this is my expectation. And it would be an act of self-control on my part to say, okay, I can comply. I will do that. So control can be completely hands-off. Control doesn't need to be sexual. It can take the form of like daily rituals, daily protocols. It can take the form of, I really like being tied up, right? Restriction of movement, control of movement. All of that falls under bondage and discipline. When I mention 50 Shades, that's usually what people are most familiar with, and that would be DS, which is dominance and submission. So these can overlap and blur because DS is really about exchange of authority. And we can sometimes use authority and control as like synonyms, but here they mean very different things because control is literally controlling of behaviors. Authority, we're talking about who has the final decision-making power. So if we're negotiating what time to start the podcast and you're like, look, we're doing it at 4 or you're not doing it at all. Guess who has the final decision-making authority in our relationship? A lot of times, I mean, this exists in every relationship, in boss and employee, in podcast host and guest, in parent and child. The only difference is that in DS, it's intentional and negotiated. It's not this sort of like de facto cultural expectation. The people sit down and they talk about, where do I want you to have authority in our relationship? Where do I want to give up some and not have it? What do I want to be in charge of? And what do I not want to be managing for you? It's a negotiated exchange of authority. I mean, that can look like, I want you to stand in the corner for the podcast. But those are two different things. You're exerting your authority and asking me to exercise control. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Then the one that often feels scariest to people, which is SM, sadomasochism. It can be two things, sadism and masochism. But the research shows that most people that are like one, like the other. So we squish them together and we call it sadomasochism for the most part. When we see this in pop culture, when we see this in a lot of the literature, people think about it as pain, right? Giving pain, the sadist, the sadistic person that's inflicting pain on others, the masochist that just wants to be hurt all the time. Pain is a very subjective thing, coming back to time and place, right? Different cultures around the world right now have very different relationships with pain than Americans do. In America, pain is something to be avoided, something to be prevented, something to be mitigated. We struggle to have a concept of like pain with purpose or good pain. And so I tend to not use that when I'm talking about sadomasochism because it's values laden and it's really culturally specific. So what I talk about is giving and receiving sensation. So exchange of control, exchange of authority, and exchange of sensation. The sensation can be really intense. It might not be sensation that you would personally enjoy or that I would want to watch, but once again, we're talking about negotiated, we're talking about discussed, and we're talking about mutually satisfying for everybody involved. So it could be, maybe you don't make me stand in a corner. Maybe you say, for the duration of this podcast, I want you to hold an ice cube in your hand. You are not causing me any harm, but you are definitely going to get an extreme reaction out of me over time as that cold sets in. And that would be an example of sensation. But is it pain? Maybe for you, maybe for me, it feels painful because I don't like cold. Maybe for somebody else, they love it. So when we think about BDSM, when I talk about power exchange, I'm talking about those three concepts: exchange of control, exchange of authority, and exchange of sensation.
I love it. Thank you for that. And why don't we go ahead and add 2 more terms, fetish and also vanilla.
Okay. A fetish is simply a sexual attraction to a typically non-sexual thing, which again, time and place specific, right? The Victorians, ladies' ankles, very sexy. Detroit 2025, nobody cares. So very context specific, but that's really the key thing, is it has to be a non-sexual object or body part. If I have a client who comes to me and says, I am really, really into a nice curvy bum, gotta find a partner who has a great bum. I'm just not turned on if she doesn't have a great bum. I mean, it might be a little bit of a fixation depending upon how far that's going, but it wouldn't be a fetish, because in our society, rear ends are sexualized, they're eroticized. They were to tell me that they absolutely cannot date somebody who does not have beautiful elbows, because the elbows are the core part of their fascination during sex. Caressing the arms, fondling the elbows, licking the elbows, tickling the inside of the elbows. Now we're talking about a fetish. Not because there's anything particularly like dirty or obscene about elbows, but for the exact opposite reason, because they're not something that's typically sexualized in our society. So when I mentioned high heels earlier, shoes are not typically seen as an erotic object in Western society. So a high heel fetish, if it's necessary, if somebody cannot experience sexual desire or sexual pleasure without it, it would be considered a fetish. And then vanilla. I love vanilla. Love vanilla. Because so many people look at vanilla as like an insult, right? Like it means that you're missing something. You're not cool enough. You're not edgy enough. You're not kinky enough, whatever. And I actually think it's the exact opposite. I grew up with a grandma who baked, and vanilla was always in our house, and vanilla was in everything. But in the before times, before the pandemic, when I had a bricks and mortar office, I literally kept the King Arthur cookie cookbook in my office. And any client that was ever like, oh, they're too vanilla for me, or, oh, I'm so vanilla, it's so embarrassing, I wish I were cooler, I would pull out the cookbook and I'd be like, there's 5,000 recipes in here. I dare you to find one that doesn't require vanilla.
Yeah.
Vanilla isn't the absence of something. Like when we think about vanilla relationships, what do we think about? Loving, caring, romantic, supportive, playful, I already said romantic, erotic. Nothing about that is bad or lacking. That is the foundation everything else gets built on. All of healthy kink should also contain all of those things. Vanilla is the foundation we play with and that we might start from and like explore. But even if you don't add to it, you're not lacking anything.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because there's so much shame on both labels, like, and it's interesting how couples will come in kind of having organized that one of those labels is more wrong than the other. So I'll have a couple come in where one of them is kinky and proud, and they're kind of shaming their partner for being vanilla, or their partner is shaming themselves. Or you have the other, the other side of that, where somebody's coming in going, they're a pervert, they're kinky, they're weird, they're off. And maybe that person is also internalizing that and feeling like there's something wrong with them because they have these kink interests. And then vanilla is the best way to be, and that's the righteous way and the moral way. so I'm like, this is like when it comes to those kind of fun statements of don't yum each other's yucks and don't yuck each other's yums, right? Because you can go both ways with this. And can we just see all of these expressions as interesting, as, as valid, as things that people may have similarities and differences on, and so what, we can have those conversations and figure out where we go from here. So, but that I think is what's lacking, is this, or it's very prominent that people are judging each other or judging themselves.
I mean, that's how we're taught sexuality, really. We're not taught sexuality. We are taught reproduction. We get a very linear, very heteronormative, very goal-oriented approach to sex. And anything that falls outside of that, we're taught is wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're not procreating. You're not dating the right person. You're not having sex in the right way. Barry McCarthy, another colleague of ours, always talks about like good enough sex and successful sex. And I love asking my question, or my couples that question, like, what does successful sex look like to you? Because for some kinky people, it might not even involve your clothes coming off. So getting on the same page and recognizing that culturally we're taught that whatever you're doing, it's wrong. You know, if it's not man, woman, penis and vagina, goal oriented on having a baby, and then stopping the minute you hit menopause and you're no longer reproductive, socially, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Sense that we all come into these conversations feeling like we're the wrongest one or they're the wrongest one. But that's mostly because culturally nobody's ever taught that who they are is okay.
I would totally agree with that. And I think it's one of the primary kind of foundational issues that I typically start with most of my couples on, or partnerships, because they are very much in a space of either shaming other or shaming self. Like that's the habit. That's what we all start with. Oh, it makes me so sad to think about it. Okay, so let's take a certain maybe couple that you're thinking of as you're writing this book. And let's just start. I mean, we're not gonna be able to go through everything in the book. And I really hope people will get this book and put it on their shelves. Even if you both think you're vanilla, I still think you will definitely you will very much benefit from so many of the strategies and tips and things that Stefani shares as far as helping just communication and conversations. But let's just start kind of with a typical. Why don't you walk us through a tip, somebody that you're thinking about, and how the presentation usually comes in, and what are they sharing? How is it being shared? Because even in the book, you talk about sometimes a person will say, hey, I've never shared this with you before. But oftentimes it's like, oh, I came across a web browser and what is this? Or I came across your underwear drawer and found, clothing or toys or things that I didn't even know you were into. And so there's kind of like open and honest disclosure that's a risk, but there's also this kind of like finding out type of way that it can go about.
Yeah. And I talk about that dichotomy, the difference between disclosure and discovery. And both can be traumatic for different partners for different reasons, right? It can be traumatic for a more vanilla person who thinks that they're on the same page with their partner to have their partner sit down and be like, I really want to tell you something that's core and foundational and really important to me. And we've been married for 20 years and I've never mentioned it before now. It can also be really traumatic to open the underwear drawer and find something unexpected. But for the kinky person, we often don't necessarily think about that, right? We don't think about how hard it can be after 20 years to build up the courage to have that conversation, and how traumatic it can be to have something that we've worked really hard to compartmentalize so that we don't distress our partner, just kind of pop into the ether without preparation. And then there's like a fifth option, which clinically I think is the most toxic, which is the coerced disclosure. I know you're up to something. I know something's going on. If you don't tell me, I'm going to leave. Why aren't you telling me this? What's going on? You're keeping secrets. And they just badger it out of them. And that ends up being incredibly traumatic for both of them. So when somebody comes to me, it usually takes one of those forms. I will say often, the presenting issue is fix them. And it doesn't matter who's called. The vanilla person might have called because they found something and they want me to fix their kinky partner, because it's very distressing to have found this out. The kinky person might call and want me to fix their vanilla partner so that they'll understand and they'll be more open-minded. But usually with a partner group, mostly dyads, if we're at a point where somebody's got like a throuple or a quad dynamic, if they're already in ethical non-monogamy, this becomes less of an issue. So just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to talk about a couple. But usually the first ask is fix them, which usually means make them more like me.
Yeah.
And I actually have a whole disclaimer on my website about what sex therapy is and isn't. And I make it abundantly clear that sex therapy is not coercive, and that it's not my job to change anybody. It's not my job to convince anybody, that I'm not here to get them to put on a harness or to let you hit them or to do any number of things. That's just not what this is. So we start by debriefing what I can and can't do, what is ethical and what isn't, and kind of level set what fix them really means here. Because what it should mean is help us, not fix them.
Mm.
And if everybody is on board with help us, then the next thing I do is actually completely sort of sideline the kinky partner. I want to focus really deeply on the more vanilla person, because kinky people, if they're at a point where they know that they're kinky and they're thinking about their kink orientation and they have a clear picture of what they want, they have been giving this a lot of thought. Especially our fetishists, I love them because they can get very granular and very specific very quickly about exactly what they like and why. But again, coming back to, we don't get high quality sex ed. Most people do not have the vocabulary to do that. They haven't been given the space to do that. They haven't been given the support to do that. A kinky person has a variety of social media outlets and channels to have support in sort of really crystallizing their desires. Most vanilla people do not do that kind of work. And so that kind of puts them at an immediate disadvantage, because on one hand, the emotional impulse is, I want them to tell me everything. They've been keeping this back for so long. I want them to answer all my questions right now. Or conversely, oh, thank God, I finally told them and I want to let it all out and I just want to explain so they understand. And I just want to feel, I feel seen for the first time. And now that the spotlight's on me, I want to let it all out. And I really have to rein both of that in, because it's not a fair conversation until both parties have sort of an erotic vocabulary to use. So the first thing we do is a lot of boundary setting around, I get that you're curious and I get that you're potentially excited. And I know that there's a lot of stuff that both of you want to know right now. We're going to wait. And where we go first in my work is to really give the more vanilla identified person time to catch up, which does not mean time to become kinky. What it means is time to think about what they desire, time to think about what they fantasize about. Actually spending dedicated, thoughtful, intentional time thinking about their own erotic identity. Because we tend to fly on autopilot, right? Like, we don't get pleasure education in school. So you figure out what you actually physically enjoy through trial and error once you start having sex. And in terms of fantasy, in terms of sort of the internal life, a lot of it, again, is very media dependent. What have you read? What have you had access to? I've worked with Orthodox Jewish couples where Song of Solomon is about the sexiest thing they've ever read. And it is super, super hot. Like, I'm not saying that to diminish them at all. That is sacred scripture erotica, and I'm here for it. But that's going to give them a different vocabulary than somebody that was sneaking their dad's Playboy at 12 or reading romance novels at 14. So we have to start just by letting them catch up and thinking really deeply about who they are sexually, relationally. What do you fantasize about? When do you fantasize? And looking for themes there, looking for what feels good. There's a whole bunch of sensory activities that I have them do together that are not kinky or vanilla. They just kind of are. And the nice thing about them is I created them so that I could kinkify them. If they come back to me and they're like, we really liked this activity or this touch or this position or this texture, we hated this other one. Now we could say, well, you don't need to be kinky to like that. But if you do you realize that ties really nicely into these things over here that your partner likes? So it's really about building a shared vocabulary of desires and sensations and words and fantasies. And then we bring the kinky person back into the conversation and I start helping them tie threads. And it's not about changing anybody's label or convincing one person to be kinkier. It's just about, if I've now learned over the course of the last 9 months that when you read romance novels, you always pick ones that have sort of kidnapping and ravishment themes, right? Like captured by pirates, stolen by Vikings. Now we're getting some ideas of what your fantasy themes are. And if we learn that you really hated the sensation of leather because you just can't get over the animal factor and it's creepy and you're a vegan, but you really liked the sensation of being squeezed and held and like that tight compression, we can play with that. Now we're starting to build things that, you tend to have some ravishment fantasies and you like to be, might I suggest, bound up a little bit. And so it's using the vocabulary that we're giving them space to build to then help them find common ground and common language with their kinkier partner.
it's really, as you're talking, what's really standing out to me is that so many things that we might consider vanilla because we've never taken the time to think of it differently, maybe isn't as vanilla as we originally thought, which I think it also speaks to the myths around kink. Like when I say fantasy, even when I say, what is your fantasy? I think a lot of people just immediately think, oh, a fantasy has to be very like out of this world, almost like a, back on a bareback horse with like a blindfold and tied up from behind. And I'm like, a fantasy can be like having a romantic dinner on the beach. That can be a fantasy, right? I mean, that's not happening in where I live in Utah. I'm not having, romantic dinners on the beach, but I could fantasize about that. And that's kind of a vanilla fantasy, right? More vanilla fantasy or romantic fantasy or whatever language you want to say. And so I do think that there are a lot of things people are playing already with that are maybe vanilla-esque, but still kind of kinky-esque too, that they're not giving that language to.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's easy to modify. We're not actually asking anybody to step out of their comfort zone. We might be asking them to think about their comfort zone in a new way, or to describe their comfort zone with new words. But at no point is my goal to say, oh, this makes you deeply and truly uncomfortable and you would hate to experience this and you want nothing to do with it. All right, well, guess what the next step of therapy is? That's not what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love all of that. And I just want to go back and just, like encourage the audience to think about two things that you said. I like to say things that are meaningful twice. So one thing that you said is when you're approaching couples therapy for any reason, really, to take can you help us approach instead of can you fix my partner approach? That was really nicely stated. And then another thing that you said that I think is worth repeating is this idea that in order to fix them, what people are really saying is that can you turn them more into being like me? Because whatever I'm comfortable with, then then I'm okay. Which is really kind of stepping into differentiation work, and understanding that we are different, and that doesn't necessarily have to be as scary as we might think. But I think a lot of couples are functioning from that place of if you really loved me, you would make me comfortable, which means you would be more like me. So that's a real kind of thing to unpack. My next question is there, what you're talking about right now is exploration. I'm going to go back to maybe some psychoeducation. Are there things that people would do well to know about? Meaning, for example, things like if my partner has a rape fantasy, does that mean that they were for sure sexually abused when they were young? Or if my partner wants to be submissive, does that mean that they have, like they're immature in their development, right? I mean, all these stories that we create, are there some basic psychoeducational, like just knowledge about why we're kinky, why these kinds of things come up that can help mitigate some of these myths that really are hurtful?
So the why is trickier because everybody is different and everybody's going to have their own. There used to be a podcast. I don't know if they still do it, but they were called Off the Cuffs. And every episode they interviewed a kinky person and they always asked the same question. What was your radioactive spider bite into kink? Like, what turned you from Peter Parker into Spider-Man? It's
right.
a great question. But also it emphasizes the fact that they asked every single person that, right? There wasn't like, okay, so we know there's 3 points of entry here. Which one are you? Well, clinically, we would say the etiology, right? The etiology is, I can give you broad strokes. When studies have been done, a strong plurality of people, and I have the study on my desk, but I'm not going to read you statistics. That doesn't feel conversational. Strong plurality of people will actually tell researchers that looking back as adults, they can pinpoint a time in childhood where now that they have adult language, they can go, oh, yeah, that was the moment, right? Actually, it was just a new study that most people, that's between about like 7 and 15, which is exactly where we would expect psychosexual development, awakening, and noticing things about ourselves to happen. That's right on line developmentally. It can freak people out when I say that, though.
So meaning something happened that they can remember, that they're like, oh, that piqued my curiosity and eroticized that for me.
It's often connected to childhood play, not, I will say, to trauma. We'll get to the trauma piece. But when I say they can pinpoint something, when you read the literature, you see things like, frankly, classic Disney, right? Robin Hood, the Fox Disney version of Robin Hood, when he's tied up by the rhinoceros guards. Tiger Lily, when she's being kidnapped and got Captain Hook under her. There's Jasmine. Everybody goes to Jasmine in the red outfit, you know? So there's pop culture exposure that made them go, ooh, I don't know what that is, and I don't have words for it, but I like it. I know I like it. Mm-hmm. I've heard playground games, playing cops and robbers. I've heard playing sports, getting tackled in football, awakenings for people. But often it's connected to very benign, very joyful, very developmentally appropriate moments that don't register for the kid beyond, ooh, that's nice. And then as adults with adult vocabulary and adult perspective, the people could say, that was it. 9 years old, I was in, knew it, just didn't know what I knew.
Yeah.
And that's so important because there is a huge myth that kinky people are kinky because they're traumatized, right? That you've been abused. And this gets, again, played out in the butt of the joke or serial killer sort of trope. Mm-hmm. Minds, as a forensic social worker and forensic sexologist, one of my favorite shows. As a researcher, drives me crazy because it is not at all grounded in like realistic portrayals of people.
What was the show you referenced?
Criminal Minds.
Oh, Criminal Minds. Okay, yeah.
Focuses so much on like sexually driven crimes and sexual serial killers, and they always have this really deep trauma history. And the trauma history can be true for criminals, can absolutely be true for psychopathy. It has nothing to do with kink. Studies have looked at kinky people and trauma histories, and kinky people do not report trauma histories at a rate that is any higher than the general population. What is interesting, though, is that kinky people are more likely to have a PTSD diagnosis than their vanilla peers. And the why behind that is a big question. You know, it could be that because so much of BDSM and so much of kink is sensory, that it's a form of sort of narrative reclaiming, right? We're taking a difficult moment and we're reprocessing it and retelling it. Mm-hmm. It could also be that none of that is happening, but the clinician sees a kinky person, holds those trauma biases, and gives them a higher level diagnosis than perhaps is warranted. So we have to hold space for both of those, for the fact that when we do research, kinky people are more likely to have PTSD, but they're no more likely to have trauma.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We know from personality studies that submissive people are no more likely to be have personality disorders. You mentioned, you know, developmental delays or being sort of not fully capable of adulting, I'll say. That's not borne out in the literature. Kinky people on both sides of the power dynamic tend to fall squarely within normal range on all of the big 5 personality traits. The only real difference is you'll be shocked to hear that dominants tend to score slightly higher in narcissism. But even that slightly higher-ness falls within the range of normal. Mm. So there's no connection between kink and mental illness. There's no connection between kink and personality disorders or negative personality traits. There's sort of this fuzzy gray thing around kink and trauma, but statistically, we know that kinky people do not report trauma histories greater than the general population. All the literature that exists has consistently found that kinky people are just as mentally healthy and socially and emotionally well-developed as anybody else.
Yeah. So when you share this kind of information, what impact does that have on couples that you typically see, both for the person who is kinky and the person who is more vanilla?
It can be incredibly reassuring and incredibly validating. As a culture, Americans love our science, right? If you give me a study, I'm not even going to read it. I'm going to see that you have a citation and now that is truth and I believe it. When it's some science and you can't believe it. But being able to not just say this from sort of an unconditional positive regard perspective, but from a, no, we've really done this research and this exists across dozens of studies. This isn't one person saying this. This isn't me being supportive. this is what the science has found across decades and continents.
Mm-hmm.
It can be really de-escalating for the more vanilla person. And it can be incredibly validating for kinky people who often do spend a good part of their lives feeling, at best, weird, at worst, damaged, broken.
Mm-hmm.
And so just being able to hear that every time these studies have been done, what they find is normalcy and mental health.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. And I also love the people that I've worked with that kind of reclaim kink, even if they have a history of trauma. Like, I can remember several clients who've specifically curated events that was a reclaiming of their trauma by playing out aspects of their trauma. And in previous therapies that had been seen as problematic or worrisome. Whereas in their work with me, I was like, yeah, let's do that. Let's figure that out. How do you want to do that? How do you take back your own power? And so even when there is trauma, it can be incredibly healing depending on how people are contextualizing, and partners, because I've had partners come in going, I'm scared about what they're wanting me to do, right? Like, I'm willing to do it, but am I going to harm my partner? For example, a rape fantasy, like, I don't want to rape my partner, but even if we are going to play with some of that, am I just going to be re-traumatizing my partner? I don't want to participate in anything that would be re-traumatizing. Meanwhile, the person's saying, no, I want to do this. This will be exciting. This will be fun. This will be a reclamation.
So I teach a 16-week course, graduate level course on sexual trauma and trauma-informed care.
Mm.
And this is where you're going to get sort of the rigidly scrupulous researcher academic side of me, because it's another yes and moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, kink can be an incredibly cathartic and healing experience for people. Also, we do not have sufficient empirical evidence for me to say that kink itself is a therapeutic process.
Mm-hmm.
And holding space for that as a licensed professional, as a professor, we have to be able to have those conversations with our clients.
Yeah.
So I'm always very, very careful to say that anecdotally, this makes a lot of sense, and that people are actively doing the work of conducting studies and doing research in order to demonstrate that this is a trauma-based, effective therapeutic modality. But also, there are already existing modalities that mimic and mirror this, right? Like when I am consulting with clinicians that are really freaked out by this idea, I'll stick with your example of, they want to redo their rape scene. They want to they want to they think they're going to take it back. They think they're going to change it somehow. I bring up, things like TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy for adolescents, or narrative therapy. As clinicians, we already do that. We already have evidence-based modalities where what we do is we say, tell me the story. Tell me again. Tell me again, tell me again, until it's no longer activating. And so while I can't, as a licensed provider, say, yes, absolutely, this is therapeutic, I can absolutely say, I understand why the research is happening, because we already use these same techniques. So It makes intuitive and rational sense that if somebody is taking something that was a horrible moment in their life and they're changing that narrative, and they're choosing who their partner is, and they're choosing when it's happening, and they're knowing from the get-go what the boundaries are, and they're knowing what is and is not going to happen, why do we care if the story they're telling is a painful story? Because that's what I would be having them do in therapy anyway.
Yeah.
It's the same process of retelling, reclaiming, and deactivating.
Yeah, I love that. And I really appreciate your languaging around this, because I do think it's really important to be evidence-based and to understand what the limitations are of the research we have, as well as the exciting parts of it. So, and I'm glad to also hear that this is being studied more. I think we really need that.
Doesn't mean that it's not therapeutic. It just means we're still documenting. That's all.
Mm-hmm, right. All right. Before we run out of time, because I want to get to two kinds of questions. So I'm guessing couples might, they're coming in with this maybe fear. Like the vanilla person is like, oh, am I going to be pressured to be more kinky than I'm comfortable being, and is that going to be the expectation? And maybe the kinky person is fearful that am I never going to be able to experience some of these things I want to experience because I'm in a monogamous relationship? And I'm guessing there's, like in most of my experiences, it's a mixture of all these things. We usually find ways people can lean into each other and meet each other where they're both at. And sometimes that's like for real, like, wow, you introduced me to something that I didn't realize I would like. And now I'm like, wow, this is really like, I'm excited. And other times it's less like that. It's kind of like, well, I don't mind doing this with you every now and then, but it's not like my total cup of tea. But, as long as it's not an expectation, a lot of the time, I can do this in a way that's healthy and pleasurable and fun still, even though it's not all the time. So usually negotiations fall into those kinds of spaces. And then, of course, there's the things that just don't work out. Like that really is not going to work for me, right? Even though it really works for you. And so there's going to be some grief or some disappointment or some sadness around that for both people for different reasons. So maybe we'll finish up this conversation with you talking about what are the typical ways people do negotiate some of these things that you see being successful. And I know that can look 500 different ways. This is a complicated question, but I hope I'm making myself somewhat clear.
I think honestly, in some ways, you did a lot of the answering for me, right? Because we tend to see a mix of, I actually never knew this existed, or I knew it existed, but I never thought you'd be open to it, or some other sort of inspiration point that does become exciting. And it might not be as important to them as it was to their kinky partner. It might be like a fun new hobby as opposed to, no, this is a core part of my identity. But they find mutual pleasure. They find excitement. They find joy there. Path 2, most common path, is that everybody gives a little. I said that one of the things I love about working with fetishists is how just granular and specific they can be. And sometimes that means you're not going to get that specific. You're just not. And so it's finding compromise, and it's being able to kind of, I'm going to say, have space to grieve the parts that you were hoping you'd get that didn't work out. Mm-hmm. That's okay. You're allowed to be sad that you made an overture, the overture wasn't fully received. Mm-hmm. That's not kink shaming. That's not vanilla shaming. That's just human nature. Maybe you do want the romantic dinner on the beach and you live in Utah. So your partner's like, yes, we can have a romantic dinner outside in the woods every night of the week, or we can go to Red Rock. So we can do everything but the beach part. You're going to be very romantic and very pleased and very grateful that your partner is doing the romantic dinner. There's still going to be a part of you that kind of wishes it were happening on a beach, and that's okay. So those compromise conversations and finding space for pleasure and joy and gratitude, even when we don't get 100% of what we want. A very small number of the people that I work with just don't find common ground. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. And that's really important. You had told me in the beginning to tell you the interesting, relevant things about me that weren't in the intro. And I completely forgot about this, but I also have a master's in theology. So I tend to approach things from a faith-based science perspective. And I'm Jewish. So in the Jewish tradition, marriage is too sacred to stay in a bad one. Like, divorce is a mitzvah in Judaism because you should be with your right person. If we're staying in a bad relationship, we're actually kind of harming 4 people, right? I'm harming myself, I'm harming you, and we're both denying the people we're supposed to find the opportunity to find us.
Oh, wow.
So as a clinician, I am really comfortable with the relationship not working out.
Yeah.
I tell people that in their very first session. I say that I'm a clinical social worker. I'm not an LMFT. I'm not a psychologist. Like, the human in the room is always going to be my client, not the relationship. I want the humans in the room to be happy and healthy. And if they can do that together, awesome, we will get there. And if they can't, I want them to know from day one that they are my priority, not the relationship. And there are rare instances where this work turns into just, we're never going to find common ground. This is just a fundamental mismatch. And that doesn't make either of them bad people. That doesn't make somebody a kink shamer if they can't do what their partner wants them to do. It's just a matter of we can love each other and be amazing people and awesome friends and great co-parents, but we're not going to be effective as a married partnership. And I'm really, really comfortable with that because I want people to have the opportunity to be as happy and healthy as possible.
Yeah, well, even with my background as an MFT, I'm very comfortable with that, because even though I do oftentimes maybe use a little bit different language than you, that I am treating the relationship in the room and the individuals. A lot of times that just because we're treating the relationship doesn't mean the relationship is worth treating. Right. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about you bringing this up, because I think this is really important permission for people to have, is this idea that we could split up for the sole reason of sex. That seems to be like a very taboo reason to break up. Right? Like that's shallow somehow, or that, what about all these other aspects of me? Why isn't that enough? Like sex should be this kind of auxiliary or this thing that shouldn't be as important as other parts of our life. And I don't mean just the behavior of sex. I mean sexuality as a whole.
On one hand, it comes back to like the old joke, just lie back and think of England, right? Coming back to, we don't teach people that pleasure matters. For me, in Jewish tradition, pleasure matters. If you look at wedding contracts at the Jewish ketubot that we still sign today, if you go back to the Middle Ages, like 12, 13, 14, 1500s, female sexual pleasure was a obligation that was written into the marriage agreement. It's based on the husband's profession. If he's a sailor and you're only going to see him once every 6 months, you can't have the same expectation that you do if he's a shop owner and he's home every night. And a shop owner is going to be different than somebody who's laboring in a field doing heavy manual work every day. But in my tradition, they literally write sexual pleasure into the relationship. And it's unilateral. Women can divorce their husbands for failing to please them sexually, but husbands cannot divorce their wives for the same thing. Okay. So for me, just culturally and religiously, I'm much more comfortable with the idea of sex as a reason for divorce. But as a Mexican, I know that as our broader culture, that's not a message that we get. And it feels shallow and it feels selfish. But what it comes back to is that sex is a blessing. Sex is a gift. Sex is not something we should have to tolerate, either doing or living without. Sex should be playing a positive force in our role, whatever form it takes. And if it's not, then people deserve to be happy and healthy, and people deserve the pleasure that they want, whether it's more or less or what flavor.
That's beautiful. All right. I want to respect your time. I know you have a hard stop in about a few minutes. So is there anything I'm not asking you that you're like, why didn't you ask me about this, Natasha? I would have loved to say this and this about this book.
No, I think you always ask such good questions. I don't know that you left any stone unturned.
Okay. Okay. Well, any closing thoughts then? What would you hope for people as they pick up either one of, this book or one of your other kink affirming books? Like, what is your hope for folks?
My goal is that everybody gets to a place where they recognize that they are exactly who they are supposed to be right now. That nothing about you is broken or flawed or dirty or bad or sinful or wrong or too much or not enough. That every single person is starting from a place of wholeness. And often we're made to feel as if we're missing things because the relationship doesn't fit or the culture doesn't fit or the messaging isn't right. But I am a person of faith. My hard stop is so I can go to Friday Shabbat services. I'm just going to, I'm going to head into that moment and into that evening telling the people here that they are exactly who and what they are supposed to be. And that my work, your work, is to help them discover that and to build relationships with people who see it too.
I love that. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Again, we've been talking to Dr. Stefani Goerlich. Her book is What With Sprinkles on Top. Everything vanilla people and their kinky partners need to know to communicate, explore, and connect. She's a fabulous writer. I've loved all the books. What's the next book that's coming up? What's the topic?
So BDSM and Kink, The Basics just came out in October, but my partner and I, from the Securing Sexuality podcast, have been working on Securing Sexuality, the book, and that will be out next year. So that looks at the intersection of intimacy and technology and how our use of technology is changing our approach to relationships and our understanding of intimacy.
Okay, there you go. She's definitely one to follow. So follow her. We will make sure that we put in the notes and in the Facebook comments and everything where you can find Dr. Goerlich and her fabulous work. Thank you so much for all of your contributions to our field and for spending this lovely time with me and my audience. I really appreciate it.
You're always delightful.
Oh, thank you. And enjoy the rest of your spiritual evening and taking time for yourself. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.